So I saw a tweet from Elon Musk the other day that got me thinking again about this whole reparations debate. So this was on the back of another tweet by Tommy Robinson, who was talking about reparations. And he pointed out that it still exists in parts of the world today that no one likes to talk about conveniently. Say what you want about Elon Musk, love or hate him, it's none of my business, but he's not wrong about this. And it reminded me how one-sided this entire conversation about reparations has become. We keep hearing demands for money and apologies, but always aimed at the same countries for the same chapters of history, while ignoring everything else that doesn't fit the narrative. And in recent months, there have been calls again for reparations. For example, in June 2025, the government of Jamaica formally petitioned King Charles, urging him to evaluate Britain's historical role in the transatlantic slave trade. What's the main aim? To frame slavery as a crime against humanity in legal terms, and which means that it lays the groundwork for possible reparations. Shortly after that, other campaigners brought the issue to Westminster and Brussels, insisting that reparations should go beyond words and be basically written into law. So, the first thing I will say is this. Calls for reparations are not just about acknowledging the past. They are demands that today's governments, and more importantly, today's citizens, accept responsibility for actions committed by past generations. So I will go through why I think reparations is a bad idea. Some of you may have heard some of these arguments before, but it seems like for some people it's not sinking in. So that's why I will say all again. Firstly, there is the obvious issue of what some people call temporal distance. These events happened so long ago. I'm talking centuries now. The actual people directly responsible are long dead. So are the actual victims. So to ask today's taxpayers, many of whom may have no direct ancestral ties to colonialism or slavery, to shoulder this financial burden for historical wrongs is in fact wrong and unconscionable. And also, it's just so convoluted. There are so many layers and none of them really make sense. On one side, you've got calls for reparations to be paid to African and Caribbean nations. The argument being that they're still underdeveloped in many areas and that colonialism or slavery, legacy of slavery, is the reason why. I'll come back to that point later. But then you've also got people here in the UK, some campaign groups, activists, who are saying reparations should be paid within this country too. That black communities in Britain, especially those from the African diaspora, are still affected by the legacy of slavery and colonialism and are therefore entitled to compensation or special treatment through domestic policies. So the obvious question is, who exactly qualifies? Who is affected? How do you decide? Where does that place someone like me? I live in Britain. I'm a British citizen. I'm also Nigerian by heritage. My ancestors weren't enslaved, not that I know of. But am I owed anything? Or because I live here and pay taxes, am I actually expected to help fund these reparations? I can't be both. I can't be a recipient and a payer. My race or racial identity might put me in the recipient category, but my citizenship puts me firmly in the payer category. So which is it? It's just confusion wrapped in ideology and guilt politics. And it becomes even more absurd when you realize who would actually end up paying for all of this. It wouldn't be some abstract class of historical villains. It would be today's taxpayers, like I said, many of whom working class, some of them immigrants, many of them with no ancestral link to slavery or empire whatsoever. So what are we going to do? Start cherry picking which white people are morally acceptable to tax? Or are we going to tax everyone regardless of background to fund a scheme based on inherited guilt? What are we doing here? Because let's be honest, like I said, reparations is not going to, in practice, punish long dead perpetrators. You're just shifting money around in the present based on vague and inconsistent ideas around collective guilt and inherited entitlement. Britain today is not the Britain of 2 centuries ago. And in fact, Britain's most significant role in the history of slavery wasn't in sustaining it, it was in ending it. The British Empire was the first major global power to abolish the transatlantic slave trade, and it spent vast sums of money and resources enforcing the abolition around the world. British naval patrols intercepted slave ships, freed captives, helped suppress the trade at a time when it was still highly desirable and profitable and widely accepted everywhere else. And this assumption that reparations would automatically or magically lead to development or national success in some of these nations is a flawed idea. And this is often one of the arguments made in favor of reparations, that historical injustices like slavery and colonialism are the reason African nations struggle today, and that if they would somehow receive financial compensation, those struggles will somehow be magically resolved. But is that really true? Does receiving money from European governments automatically mean better government, better infrastructure, less corruption, more opportunities? I don't necessarily think so. Not automatically. These problems today are far more complex than their legacy of empire. Yes, colonialism caused harm, but so have decades of internal mismanagement, poor leadership, weak institutions, misplaced priorities. Reparations won't solve these problems, and that's why I believe some of these demands will continue. Billions have already been given to African nations in aid over the years. The UK alone has sent enormous sums in development assistance. So the question is, what has been done? What has been done with it? Where has the money gone? I can tell you some places it has gone, right? Some of their pockets of these leaders. Because if the condition of many of these countries is anything to go by, it hasn't gone to improving infrastructure, education, healthcare, job creation. Are people that naive to think that just because you change the semantics and you say, well, this is reparations, this is not aid, that it will automatically create a different outcome? The people who need help will not see it. And worse still, the demand for reparations risks giving failed leadership an excuse to underperform again, instead of focusing on reform, accountability, and government. They'll point back to history and say, well, we're still waiting for what's owed us. It's not enough. Right? It's not enough. Meanwhile, ordinary people remain stuck in the same cycle of poverty, neglect, broken promises. And there's another thing missing from this whole reparations conversation, something everyone tiptoes around, but I won't. And that is the role that African elites and rulers played in enabling and profiting from the slave trade. We talk endlessly about the role of European traders, but far less about the kings, the chiefs, and the middlemen on the African continent who actively captured and sold their own people for profit. Without their cooperation, the transatlantic slave trade, as we know it, would never have reached the scale that it did. They didn't resist it. No, that's a lie. They didn't. They maintained it. They benefited from it. In fact, some African rulers defended the trade explicitly. One of the most famous examples comes from King Gezo of Dahomey, present-day Benin, who in the 1840s told the British abolitionists, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and glory of their wealth. The gods have approved it." These were not naive players in a European game, and to keep saying that they were is pretty much insulting. They were active, strategic participants. They waged wars to capture people. They sold them on coastal markets. They used the profits to build their kingdoms, fund armies, maintain power. So when we talk about who owes what to whom, I want to ask, what do African states owe their own people? What do they owe their descendants, the diaspora? Because to me, that is the more important question. Because there is where you find a deeper betrayal. To sell strangers is one thing. To sell your own people, your brother, your mother, and call it divine, that is something else entirely. I mean, imagine if I was sold by my own family, let's say my own brother, into another family, and that new family mistreated me. Who bears the heaviest sin? The family that abused me, or my brother who gave me away in the first place? That's how I see Africa's role in the transatlantic slave trade. Yes, the Europeans were wrong, of course, evil, what they engaged in, what they allowed themselves to be involved in, absolutely barbaric. But that is the part everyone already talks about. What isn't talked about enough in mainstream circles is the fact that African leaders initiated this betrayal. And in my view, they have the biggest sin, and they should bear the first and greater responsibility. And sometimes it wasn't even for anything of lasting value. They sold people, human lives, for things like metal, iron, beads, low-grade manufactured goods. That makes it even more painful. They were so short-sighted and greedy. How do you justify trading away your people for items that would be useless within a generation? That part of the story is rarely told, but it needs to be, because you cannot claim justice if you are only willing to tell half the truth. For anyone that needs to hear this, the fact that your country is not developed, or that your community is not where you want it to be if you're here in the UK, is not because someone owes you money. It's not because someone hasn't said sorry to you. Too many people are obsessed with looking backwards. Why is it that some people from these same so-called impacted communities go on to thrive? Same history, same background, but different outcome. Why? Because it's the mindset. It's the level of self-ownership. It's the refusal to be defined by the past, by struggle, by victimhood. It's not your circumstances holding you back. It's your thinking. It's a weak mind. Be offended all you want. I really don't care. Offense comes and goes, but the truth remains. You can't build a future while clinging to a narrative of helplessness. At some point, you either take responsibility for your life or you stay stuck blaming ghosts.